I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
At the start of the Second World War, the British Empire was still the largest empire in the world. It stretched over a third of the Earth's surface, and it controlled over 500 million subjects. Now, as war was declared, the situation changed very drastically. France fell to the Germans in June 1940, and as a consequence, Britain relied on its empire. As the British Empire became drawn into the Second World War, there was a need to call black troops from the Caribbean, from Africa and other colonies into the war.
I'm from Kingston, Jamaica. I was born in August 1925. I went to school in Jamaica, and I went to college, and right up until the war started, and they asked for volunteers for the Royal Navy. I applied and was accepted, and I served in the Royal Navy from 1941 to 43. And then they asked for recruits for the RAF, Air Sea Rescue Service. I applied and was accepted.
My name is Sam King. I was born in Jamaica. I left school at 15, and at 16 my father was ill, and I had to take over the family farm. When I was about 18, I passed to go to America and work on the farm, and I passed to come to England, the Royal Air Force. And my mother said, "Son, the mother country is at war, go. And if you live, it will be a good thing." She was right, and I'm here today.
At that time, my father was my idol, and I saw myself in the future like my father. But he didn't want me to take up that as a living, because he said it was a dog's life. He was the skipper for the inter-island cargo boats. And he was the first Jamaican skipper, because it was all these Europeans or Caymanians that were skippers. But my father was the first native Jamaican to break through as a skipper for the inter-island cargo boats. When I enlisted for the Navy, I was just over 16, but I was a big fella, and I was accepted. I saw it as a way that if I eventually survived the war, I would have a profession to start with. And my ambition was to be a merchant Navy deck officer. But looking back now, I was way ahead of time in thinking of such a thing, because there were no such things as any black merchant Navy officers.
At the heart of the British Empire was a strict hierarchy. This hierarchy was racial as well as a class hierarchy. At the top of the hierarchy were white military or white officials, and this was the case across most of the colonies. Now, the Army Manual of Military Law in 1914 said very clearly that only officers of pure European descent could command troops. Black troops were not allowed in those positions as officers or non-commissioned officers.
During a war, you have to rely mostly on oil, and Trinidad and Curacao, which was one of the main oil producing place, all in that area. The tankers were very busy, and the submarines were very busy, sinking as much as they could. Anything that is afloat, the submarines had their own way, and we were on convoy patrols, but all we were doing is picking up survivors. The only ships that the British had was 3 ships in that area to control the whole area. on the ocean, for some reason, is very, very, very dark on the ocean. You put your hand out and you can't see it. It's so dark. And that was the worst part of it, because in the days you could see the mines that the submarines lay. You could see it, but in the night you see nothing. So if you happen to survive the night, next day you would say to yourself, thank God I'm alive to see another day.
It's estimated that 1/3 of the merchant navy were killed or injured during the war. So it's a very dangerous work carried out by thousands of Caribbean volunteers, and it's something that perhaps people don't know about today, because we just sort of just look at the glamorous battles of D-Day or the Battle of Britain. But the everyday supplies to Britain were of absolute importance. Without supplies, Britain would have starved and would have had to give in to the Germans. But the merchant navy kept Britain supplied and fed during the war, and thousands of Caribbeans were part of the merchant navy.
And around that time now, they made inquiries for volunteers for the RAF, different trades in the RAF, and I decided to make an application for the Air Sea Rescue Service, which means that I would be on crash boats, which I did. And I served in that from 1944 until 1947. In the rescue service, we had to, speed was a main thing. And because the plane crews, they got shut down, and most of the time they're coming from an engagement, and they know that they can't make it, so they head for the channel because they stand a better chance if they crash in the sea. And our duty was to go and pick them up before they're frozen to death. On occasions, we also have to pick up German crews that were shot down. And it's surprising their reaction when they realized that they were being saved by their enemy, the British forces. And I used to sit there and watch them smiling at each other and being happy to be still alive and to be rescued.
So one of the major ways the Caribbean contributed was in the Air Force, whether as ground crew or air crew. From 1941 onwards, Caribbean started arriving and serving in bases all around England.
I arrived in Greenock, Scotland on the 9th of November 1944. And I stepped into 4 inches of snow, and I thought I was going to die because it stayed underground for a week. But by the grace of God, I'm still here. In the RAF, I was an engineer. I work on Lancaster's aircraft, Spitfires, and Dakotas. I like the American Dakotas. They're very simple. They're like Ford cars. The first time I came to London Bridge, I was frightened. The Germans had just bombed the station, and I was frightened. Then, in the environment, food was rationed. Half a pound of meat for the week, and that was bad. And that carried on until 1956. I was sent to Coventry, and it was sad. The whole of Poole Meadow for about a quarter of a mile was flat. The Germans had bombed Coventry because it was an industrial area. But we survived.
Britain was devastated. The major ports and the cities, thousands of people lost their lives, but also infrastructure was destroyed. Times were very, very difficult. The government had to introduce rationing. These are famous images now that people can look back on almost romantically, but it can't have been very funny at the time. And Caribbean men and women were subject to those same experiences of where the bombs were fallen or having so much that they could spend their money.
I, during the forces, worked with people from Norway to the Sudan, and we all had to work together to beat Nazi Germany. The privilege of working or living from RAF Hawkins in Folkestone to RAF Kinloss in Scotland and about 10 places in between. And I had no racial problem.
What would be the response of people to the Caribbeans? and most of the experiences that have been recorded are very positive, of people welcoming men and women from the Caribbean.
When I went to going to Cosford, I had my kit bags and things, and the children at the station came and wanted to help and take this and take that. And they want me to speak because they haven't seen a colored person before. And I also was blessed that 2 English families took me. The Seagraves, 15 Montague Street, Bulwell, Nottingham, and the Chalice, 2 Renshaw Corner, Mitcham. I know where the keys are, and if they were not there, I just go in. And I remember when I was going back to Jamaica, I went to see Mom, or the Seagraves in Bulwell, Nottingham, and Mom cried, "I won't see my Suma again." She cried.
However, a problem arose from 1941 onwards, when the United States entered the war, and of course the United States Army and all branches of its armed forces were segregated. And when the troops arrived in Britain, they were segregated, and the War Office and the American military had many conversations regarding Britain's black colonial troops. The Americans would have liked to have seen them segregated, like the American troops were segregated, but Britain was very aware of feelings and sentiment in the colonies.
Yes, well, when the America went into the war now, and they started coming to Europe, racism was very, very in action, and the white Americans couldn't realize that the British population accepted the black Americans. So, for instance, you'd be having a drink with a white girl, and a group of white Americans come in and says, "Okay, get out of here." Well, when you say that word to a West Indian, it's like putting a red cloth before a bull, and we used to go haywire. And the white Americans couldn't understand what was happening, because in their country, no black American would ever attempt to put up any resistance to them. And we used to have very, very big fights. And the British used to come on our side because they also resented the white Americans operating in the way that they usually do. But after a while, they realized that don't mess with these West Indians. They are different, because they fight back. But the black Americans, they dare not fight back, because they would lock them up, and they would never see outside again, and they would be pushed to the front. Well, when things really got hot in Germany, the whole scene changed, because around that time they decided to put a stop to the American racism in the services. When the war in Europe finished, we were very, very busy mopping up arrangements. So we had to do more patrols, because, for instance, most of the submarines were told to surrender. So we had to make certain that they surrendered and ditched their torpedoes and everything. So we were very busy. We hadn't much time to celebrate then, because Japan was still active. Well, the war in Japan was finished, and then the next movement was for us to be sent back home to Jamaica. Quite a good amount of us wanted to remain here, but they says, "No, all of you must go back home." When we went back to Jamaica now for demobilization, no arrangement was made in Jamaica, because the Jamaican government thought it was the responsibility of the British government to arrange a rehabilitation, and they thought that it was a Jamaican responsibility. Anyway, they suddenly got together and formed some form of rehabilitation.
I wanted to stay here. They said, "No, you're from the colony of Jamaica, you have to go back." When I went back, it was unplanned. All the men from the forces were thrown back. The men who had gone to America was thrown back, and everything was in confusion.
1939-45 Star was awarded for 6 months operational command during 1945. the Atlantic Star was awarded to personnel on His Majesty's ships, merchant vessels, 6 months qualifying in the Atlantic and home waters. The Defense Medal awarded for active service during 1939-1945, and the War Medal was for overall service with good conduct on discharge from the services. Length of service, September 1941 to February 1947.
I have some medals. That for being in the war for 6 months, that for being in the Royal Air Force for 6 months, and this was given by the Queen with the MBE for serving in the community. So when you write to me, please, you should write Sam King MBE. This one is for being the mayor of the London Borough 7.
Yes, well, I'm very happy to be in a position to make something that the future generation will be able to look at, to see the contribution that the West Indians, the Africans, and the Indian troops made for the British Empire to be successful to end the war with Germany. And I hope that years to come, the future generation will be able to read and have an official count of what we contributed to make this world a better place.
I think the young people, or the people in general, should know that during the war, people volunteered from outside of Britain to fight for king and country. And we in Jamaica volunteered 15,000 of us. And thank God most of us survived, but many died, especially air crew types. And they should know that people die to give them freedom.
Part of this victorious force, millions of Black, African, Caribbean, Asian, from Australia, from North America, they all served to defeat the Axis threat, and they eventually prevailed. So that's why it's important that we remember it as a world war, not as a white war, which sometimes, unfortunately, the images that are shown in history books or in films seems to portray. We don't get a sense that many races, ethnicities, nationalities were involved. And I think that this is a good time to reappraise that view of the war. It's called a world war for a reason, and all studies of the war should reflect that, and the time for doing that is now.
Bread with butter and jam, 7 eggs in the morning, big junk of ham. Today I living like a wandering bird. If I see the first or second, I can't find me third. I living by guess, so have sympathy, since the war declared with England and Germany. I am so hard pressed in this colony that the stores refuse to sell a suit of khaki. Me boot sole gone, it twist on the side. With all this prosecution, I must abide. If I have a cigarette, I can't find a match. I can't trim me hair, I wearing saddle patch. Me shirt on me back, it start turning green. Since the Hitler depression came and intervened.